Hey guys, welcome to Hughes History as we hit you up with a little bit of world history, Egyptian style. Guys, we are going ancient Egypt on you. We're going to cover the Old Kingdom, so this is perfect if you're a kid in school, a teacher flipping your classes, or maybe you're just cray-cray on the internet. Either way, we're going to go giddy up for the learning, and we're going to go get her done right now. All right, guys, let's start where we always start when we're talking about civilizations, and that is geography. And of course, we're going to need some water, because water is really important. And just like Mesopotamia, where we have the Tigris and Euphrates, we're going to have a river system that's going to be the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. And of course, that is the Nile. Egypt is called the gift of the Nile for a reason. Now, if we start with the very basics, the Nile runs about 4,100 miles, and it actually flows from the south to the north. So it starts in what today would be Ethiopia, Tanzania, kind of the highlands of central eastern Africa, and it runs its 4,000-mile journey into the Mediterranean Sea. But Egypt isn't going to be able to use all of that Nile because there are points in the Nile which are kind of impassable at that point. It's called the First Cataract, which is about 750 miles south of the Mediterranean Sea. And this cataract, which is basically jagged cliffs and boulders and rapids, is really going to form the starting point for Egyptian society. Now, the Nile is generally divided along that 750-mile strip in Egyptian civilization into two sectors. You have what's called the Upper Nile, and the Upper Nile, which is highlighted right there, is actually in the lower portion of Egypt, but that's going to be characterized really by a thin strip of fertile soil surrounding that river. And as we get into the Lower Nile, which is in the upper part, that's going to be characterized by a delta, which is very lush and wider and larger because it's flowing into the Mediterranean Sea. So there are going to be different parts of the Nile, but starting around 5000 BCE, we're going to see kind of farming villages pop up along the 750 strip of the Nile River. Now, in the upper portion, which is that thin strip, you're surrounded by desert. So that's going to isolate those farming villages, allowing them to grow. We're not going to have a lot of invasions and warfare because of that natural protection. But it's also going to make trade a little bit more difficult because you're not going to be able to cross those deserts 5, 6, 7,000 years ago. Now, the Nile, unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates and other rivers in early civilizations, is predictable. Some of those other rivers would just flood whenever the time would be, but every July when the snow would melt in the mountains of Central Eastern Africa and the rain would come, the Nile would flood basically from July to October. So this kind of repeating pattern of flood, plant, harvest, flood, plant, harvest became the heartbeat of Egyptian society. It was dependable. They were able to use the Nile River to sustain their lives. Now, around 3200 BCE, this is about 2,000 years into the growth of these small villages, we begin to get some trade with Mesopotamia, which has already invented cuneiform and other awesome technologies, which is going to allow Egypt to grow a little bit quicker because of those trade routes. It's in around 2000 BCE, they're going to be able to figure out how to navigate that Nile River for transportational purposes. It's pretty easy going from the south to the north because the river goes that way. But once they figure out sails, which Mesopotamia is going to invent, they're going to be able to navigate the river using the trade winds which flow from the north to the south. And then eventually they're going to be able to trade with internal Africa as they look for supplies to build their most awesome pyramids. They're going to need limestone, they're going to need gold, they're going to need ivory, they're going to need things they don't have, which they're going to have to get. So geography is really important. Make sure that you look at that map one more time and you get the big idea that the Nile is the heartbeat of Egypt as we now take a look at the Old Kingdom of ancient Egyptian society. Are you ready to unify? Good. But we need something to unify. And considering from about 5000 BCE to about 3200 BCE, which is like 2,000 years, there isn't really a kingdom in Egypt. It's a sparkling, I don't know if that's a word in this sense, a sparkling of villages along the Nile River that are kind of growing up all by themselves. They have their own chieftains, their own customs, their own gods, their own rituals. But there's not much known about that time period, of course, because there's no internets. But by around 3200 BCE, legend says, and it's only a legend, that Egypt, in a sense, was united into what was a lower and an upper kingdom. And the legend says that the king or the head of the lower kingdom had a red crown, and the head of the upper kingdom wore a big white bowling crown. And we do know around 3100 BCE that the leader of the upper kingdom, who was Menes, was able to unite the two kingdoms, and he wore a white and red crown. How about that? And he made the capital of this new Egyptian kingdom at Memphis, which is at the point where the upper and the lower kingdom came together. So being a little political there, right? Just like Washington, D.C., between the north and the south. I got off track a little bit. But this is really going to be the first dynasty located in Memphis by Menes. But other than that basic legend, not much is known until really the third dynasty. Now, there'll be 31 dynasties in Egyptian history, which stretches across about 2,600 years, which is ridiculously long. But we do know that the third dynasty is really the beginning of the Old Kingdom, when we're going to be beginning to get written records and really the markings of a true ancient civilization. So around 2660 BCE, which again is the beginning of the Old Kingdom. And now we can talk about the characteristics of the Old Kingdom in ancient Egypt, which I'm going to do with you right now. All right, why don't we start with characteristic number one of the ancient Egyptian civilization, which is going to be where you take the alien when they ask you, take me to your leader. And that, of course, is going to be the pharaoh. You want to go eat up some good vocab? Write that word down right there. The pharaoh is the leader of Egyptian civilization. Not only are they like a king, but they are not just like a god. They are God. And this is a differentiation from what we talked about when we did Mesopotamia, where the leader or the ruler is a representation of God, not God themselves. So people are literally seeing the pharaoh as somebody that needs to be pleased because they run the universe. They are in control of the sun, of the floods, of the crops, of truth, of justice. They're in charge of it all. And it was believed that when you passed on and when the pharaoh passed on, that their soul was eternal. It was called the eternal spirit Ka, K-A, the Ka. And this spirit would reign forever. So that's why they needed a place to let the Ka live. Hence the pyramids. So the Old Kingdom, and this is again, 4,000 years ago, are going to be the people that built the pyramids. And you don't have to say much to be awestruck by looking at the pyramids, but knowing that they hadn't invented the wheel, that there's no light source other than the sun, that it took up to 2 million blocks of stone to build a pyramid like the pyramid at Giza. It's going to be about 481 feet tall, and these 2 million blocks, each one of them weighs roughly 5,000 pounds. And those 5,000-pound blocks, which was limestone in this case, were up to 400 miles upriver. So in order to transport 2 million 5,000-pound stones, to have no internal light source, to have no wheel, and to be able to build these 480 feet structures to house the Ka, which is the eternal spirit of the pharaoh, is pretty incredible. Like, to this day, scientists are still trying to figure out how did they build the pyramids. If my hair stuck up really high, I'd say it was the aliens themselves. But my hair's pretty flat today. So we're going to go with that they were just an incredibly advanced early civilization that was able to figure out the mathematics, the algebra, the physics of actually creating these awesome structures. And of course, this is where the pharaohs are going to be laid to rest in order to have their eternal spirit, their Ka, reign forever and ever and ever. But the most important lesson is that in order to do all of that, you can just imagine the advanced governmental systems that had to be in place to run a job that big. So make sure that you get the pharaohs and, of course, the big idea of the pyramids as we move on and we take a look at the religious life of an ancient Egyptian living in the Old Kingdom. I'm going to go get one right now. So like Mesopotamia, and perhaps because of Mesopotamia, you have to remember that the Egyptians are in contact with Mesopotamia. Mesopotamians invented sails and such, are also going to be polytheistic. They're going to believe in many gods. But the one differentiation is going to be that they believe in an afterlife. The Mesopotamians believe that it's just like all darkness. The Egyptian believes that the soul lives forever. So there's some important gods and goddesses in Egyptian polytheistic ancient civilization religions, and that would be number one, Ra. Ra, Ra, Ra. Ra is the god of the sun, and of course you could figure out why that would be really important. Horus is the god of light, another highly regarded god in Egyptian civilization. Isis, Isis, I-S-I-S, was the goddess of motherhood, of woman, of feminine energy. And one of the scarier ones is going to be Osiris, who is the god of death, and we'll talk about him in a second. But all Egyptians, like the pharaoh, believe that their souls, their bodies, need to be taken care of in the afterlife. And this is why we get the concept of mummification. There was a belief that when you died, that Osiris, the god of death, would weigh your heart. And then if your heart was light as a feather, you could live eternally in the other world. But if it was weighed down with sin, that they would actually have the devourer of souls eat your heart. So this meant that your deeds on the physical earth meant something, and that they would be judged upon your death. And of course, those concepts are going to flow into Judaism and other major world religions. But mummification, like I mentioned before, is really important. And actually, the process by which they mummified people is really interesting. I'd like to read you a little passage right now about how they mummified people. First, they draw out the brains through the nostrils with an iron hook. Then, with a sharp stone, they make an incision in the side and take out the bowels. Then they fill the belly with pure casa and other perfumes. They sew it up again, and when they have done this, they steep it in a mineral salt, leaving it under for 70 days. At the end of 70 days, they wash the corpse, and they wrap the whole body in bandages of wax and cloth. These guys are serious about their belief that the afterworld counts. They want to make sure that the body is preserved. And as it's preserved and as it's mummified, it's then put into a coffin and into a tomb where it's surrounded by everyday things that you would need to live. So they would leave food and jewelry and clothing, as well as hymns and prayers and magic spells. And actually, the Book of the Dead is a collection of all of these prayers and these hymns and these magical spells that were left behind with these mummified coffins for hope that they would pass the big test of the weighing of the heart in the afterlife. So, mummification, polytheism, the different gods and goddesses of Egyptian life, very, very important. Now let's take a look at basically the social system of Old Kingdom Egypt. Let's do it right now. Right now! So again, like Mesopotamia, notice how I keep saying that, like Mesopotamia. They're also going to have a social class system that is hierarchical, that is like a pyramid. Of course, on the bottom of that pyramid, you're going to have slaves, and then moving upwards, we're going to basic laborers, to farmers, to artisans, and then to merchants, to the military, to priests, and all the way up on the tippy top of the triangle is the pharaoh, of course. But unlike Mesopotamia and unlike some other social class systems, it's not a static system. You could learn how to get an education, and if you did, you could move up that system and you could marry into other systems. And interestingly enough, women were considered to be equal of men in Egyptian life. Not only could they own property and could they trade and be merchants, but they could also demand a divorce. And in the divorce, they were entitled to part of the property that was shared with their spouse. So that's going to go away for a very long time. But it shows you that in ancient civilizations, they didn't exactly see men and women as we're going to see them develop in Europe and in Western civilization until really we get until the 20th century. Now, there's also, of course, other really important aspects of Egyptian life that we should mention. Of course, they have been to Mesopotamia. They've been to the mountaintop. There's not really a mountaintop there. But they do come back with the idea of writing, of cuneiform. And their cuneiform is going to be called hieroglyphics. And like cuneiform, it basically starts off with symbolism, Little picture of a monkey is a monkey. And eventually those symbols become sounds, become a written language. But one step that they took in front of the Mesopotamians is they're not going to use clay tablets forever. You can't even imagine how heavy it was to carry a book around back then. So they're going to be able to use some of their natural resources, and specifically papyrus, which is going to be a plant material which is going to be made into a paper-like material. So you can record lots of things. You can put it right in your pocket, and get on a boat and go down the river and teach something to somebody. And of course there's other inventions as well. Some of them are taken from the Fertile Crescent. Other ones are homegrown to Egypt, but they're going to have a written numerical system. They're going to be using geometry and algebra and different math systems. They're going to be able to use the Cyrus star to predict the calendar, and they actually had their calendar, which was 7 days and 365 days, a full year, which was only 6 hours off of the actual, calculated solar calendar. So good for Egypt. It was really close. And they were actually very advanced in medicine. And of course they used some of the evil spirit kind of stuff too, but they also learned how to use very scientifically based medical procedures, including some very rudimentary surgery. I don't know if I'd want to have a surgeon open me up back then, but they did it, which is pretty incredible. And of course the other fields such as architecture, you can just imagine building the pyramids. They use columns in many of their homes. So they're pretty far advanced for an ancient civilization without a doubt. So nothing lasts forever, and the Old Kingdom is going to come crashing on down. Why don't we take a look at the crash down right now? But don't worry, they'll be back, because if there's an Old Kingdom, there's going to be another lecture one day. You want to know what it's going to be called? That's right, kids, the New Kingdom. But that's not today. So most historians agree that the Old Kingdom saw its downfall around 2180 BCE. This is known as the First Intermediate Period, about 100 years of ancient Egyptian history, which is marked by weakness and turmoil. Some people reckon that they couldn't control the floods, that there was starvation, that there was famine, but for whatever reasons, they're lost in the Nile for about 100 years. And then at the end of those 100 years, new leaders arise. This is called the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom around 2080 BCE to about 1640 BCE. For about 500 years they regain control, and they do move on. They build a canal to the Red Sea, which is going to open up new trading routes. They figure out how to drain the swamps of the upper Nile in order to increase their farmland. They begin building dikes to control the water in a more powerful way. They begin new public work projects. So the Middle Kingdom is important. We're just not going to talk about it a lot right now. What we do know is in that 1640 BCE, we have a group of Asian nomads that are called Hyksos, who are going to invade using horse-drawn carriages. They also invaded the Indus and the Fertile Crescent. So these nomads are just cray-cray for power, and they're going to take over Egypt. This is called the Second Intermediate Period, about 1640 BCE to about 1570 BCE. And at that point, we're going to get the rise of the New Kingdom and a much more powerful system of pharaohs and civilization in general. So what do you know about that, kids? You learned something about ancient Egypt. But of course, we're going to need a new lecture soon enough called the New Kingdom to learn about what happens in the New Kingdom now that we did the Old Kingdom. We certainly hope that your brain is a little bit bigger than when you press the button. And we certainly hope that you remember always that where your attention goes, your energy flows. All right, guys, I'm done. Stick a fork in me, and we'll see you next time you press my buttons.